The standard explanation is straightforward. In the 19th century, as cities expanded and populations concentrated, governments built large institutions to manage the consequences: hospitals, asylums, sanitaria. Demand rose. Infrastructure followed. That is the accepted sequence of events. But when you examine the scale of specific structures built during that period, not the number of them, but the size of individual buildings, the sequence begins to look less straightforward. This video explores historical interpretations and unanswered questions found in existing records. It does not present definitive conclusions. Consider the dimensions. The Willard Asylum for the Chronically Insane, opened in New York in 1869, was designed from its first construction phase to house over 1,000 patients. Not eventually. From the beginning. Its laundry facilities, kitchen infrastructure, and underground utility corridors were scaled not for the population it admitted in its first decade, which was considerably smaller, but for a population that would take 30 years to arrive. The building was not built to grow. It was built complete. That is one facility. In one state. In one country. When you map similar institutions across the northeastern United States, across the British Isles, across parts of Central Europe, all constructed within roughly the same 40-year window between 1840 and 1880, a pattern of over-preparation becomes difficult to attribute to coincidence alone. The accepted explanation for large-scale asylum construction in the 19th century centers on the moral treatment movement. Reformers like Dorothea Dix in the United States and John Connolly in Britain argued, successfully, that the mentally ill deserved structured, spacious environments rather than carceral confinement. Legislatures responded. Funds were allocated. Grand buildings followed. This explanation is credible. It is well documented. It accounts for the political momentum behind institutional construction during this period. What it does not fully account for is the engineering specificity embedded in these structures before their patient populations existed. Ventilation systems in several mid-century American asylums were designed using airflow calculations that assumed full occupancy from the first year of operation. Not projected occupancy. Not optimistic occupancy. Full occupancy. The mechanical systems were not designed to be expanded. They were designed to work at maximum load immediately. In buildings where the first-year patient count represented less than 20% of design capacity, this specificity raises a question that the moral treatment explanation does not cleanly resolve. Why engineer for a population that hasn't arrived yet? The scale question becomes more precise when you move from institutional asylums to what 19th century records refer to as general hospitals, a term that covered a far wider range of building types than modern usage implies. St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, in its Victorian reconstruction phase completed in the 1850s, added ward blocks designed to treat patients across a range of conditions that, according to the hospital's own admission records from the period, did not yet represent significant patient load. The surgical theaters were sized for a volume of procedures that the hospital's own staff would not perform at that rate until the 1880s. The storage vaults beneath the main building, documented in construction surveys from 1852, were large enough to supply a facility processing 3 times the annual patient admissions recorded in the decade following completion. These are not small discrepancies. These are factors of 2 and 3, embedded in the physical dimensions of buildings that still stand. The buildings were not unusual in their quality of construction. They were unusual in the assumption of scale that the construction implies. Across the Atlantic, the pattern holds at different institutions with different funding sources, different architects, and different stated purposes. The Government Hospital for the Insane, established in Washington, D.C. in 1855, now known as St. Elizabeth's, was built on grounds covering over 185 acres. Its initial patient population numbered in the hundreds. Its infrastructure, including its farm operations, water supply systems, and administrative buildings, was sufficient for a self-contained community of several thousand. Official records describe this as forward planning. Planners anticipated growth. That phrase, anticipated growth, appears repeatedly in the documentation surrounding large institutional construction from this period. It is a reasonable phrase. It functions as an explanation. but anticipating growth by a factor of 10, at a facility whose admissions growth over the following 4 decades did not consistently justify that initial scale, is a different kind of anticipation than we typically mean when we use the term. And this was a federally funded facility, built on a specific site, at a specific moment, with a specific set of engineering decisions that no subsequent growth fully explained. Scale alone does not constitute an anomaly. Large buildings have always been built. Some are overbuilt. Some are built for futures that never materialize. What makes the 19th century institutional construction pattern worth examining more carefully is not any single building. It is the consistency of the overpreparation across facilities that shared no architect, no funding source, no regional proximity, and no obvious common directive. The same proportional relationship between initial population and designed capacity appears at the Worcester State Lunatic Hospital in Massachusetts, at the Royal Edinburgh Asylum, at Broadmoor in England, completed in 1863 with ward capacity designed for a population it would not house for another generation, at the Kirkbride Plan hospitals scattered across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, all built to the same spatial logic, all exhibiting the same ratio of infrastructure to immediate need. A design philosophy can explain why buildings look similar. It does not explain why buildings built by different people, in different countries, for different stated purposes, all appear to have been prepared for a population that had not yet arrived. Something in the foundational logic of how these structures were specified, before a single patient was admitted, assumed a scale of use that the historical record of the following decades does not consistently account for. That assumption is where the questions begin. The Kirkbride Plan is usually presented as an architectural philosophy. Thomas Story Kirkbride, a Philadelphia psychiatrist, published his principles for asylum design in 1854. Linear building arrangements. Staggered wings to maximize light and air. Separation of patient populations by condition and gender. The plan was widely adopted. Dozens of institutions across the United States were built to its specifications between the 1850s and the 1880s. What the architectural history of the Kirkbride Plan emphasizes is the design logic. What it tends to gloss over is the scale assumption baked into the plan from its first publication. Kirkbride's specifications did not describe small facilities. The minimum functional size he recommended, before accounting for staff quarters, agricultural operations, and mechanical infrastructure, implied a patient population that most of the adopting states had not yet formally identified, counted, or committed to institutionalizing. The plan was written for a system of care that did not yet exist at the scale the plan assumed. The buildings were designed. Then the populations were found to fill them. That sequence inverts the logic we normally apply to institutional planning. And it invites a question the standard narrative tends to skip past. Who decided, and on what basis, that this much space would be needed? Expand the frame beyond the United States, and the inversion appears again. Britain's Lunacy Act of 1845 mandated that every county in England and Wales construct an asylum for pauper lunatics. Within a decade, county asylums had been built across the country, many of them on a scale that exceeded the identified population of patients in their respective counties at the time of construction. The Three Counties Asylum at Alsea, opened in 1860 to serve Bedfordshire, Hertfordshire, and Huntingdonshire, was built for over 500 patients. The combined population of the three counties in the 1861 census was approximately 370,000 people. The recorded incidence of severe mental illness in mid-Victorian England, by contemporary medical estimates, ran at roughly 3 to 4 per thousand. That would suggest a combined patient pool, across all three counties, of somewhere between 1,100 and 1,500 individuals, of whom only a fraction would require institutional care at any given time. The asylum was built for 500. Within 15 years it was expanded to over 800. Within 30 years it housed more than 1,200. The expansion is the part that usually receives emphasis. Less attention is paid to the original structure, which was not expanded into its purpose. It was built large, and then expanded further. The initial scale was not a starting point. It was already a conclusion. What makes regional pattern analysis useful here is not that any single case proves anything. It is that the pattern across cases removes the explanations that work comfortably for individual instances. When a single building is overbuilt, the explanation is specific: an ambitious architect, an optimistic commissioner, a political decision to signal civic grandeur. These explanations are local. They apply to that building, in that context, for those reasons. When the same proportional relationship between design capacity and immediate population appears in Worcestershire and in Ohio and in the Scottish borders and in Ontario, with no shared designer, no shared funding body, no shared political moment, the local explanations stop working. Something more structural has to account for the consistency. Researchers who have examined 19th-century institutional construction records across multiple countries have noted this consistency without arriving at a unified explanation for it. Some attribute it to shared professional networks among asylum administrators. Some point to the circulation of British and American medical journals, which created a de facto international standard for institutional scale. Some suggest that population projections used by planners in this period were simply more aggressive than the recorded growth of institutionalized populations ultimately justified. Each of these explanations is partial. None of them, individually or combined, fully accounts for the degree of consistent overpreparation embedded in the physical fabric of these buildings. Move from medical institutions specifically to what 19th-century records group under the broader heading of public health infrastructure, and the pattern extends. The sewerage and water supply systems built in conjunction with many of these institutions, systems that in several cases predated the urban infrastructure of the surrounding towns, were designed to processing loads that far exceeded institutional need. The water tower at the Coney Hatch Lunatic Asylum in North London, constructed in the 1850s, had a storage capacity sufficient for a population several times the size of the asylum itself. The drainage system was engineered for flows that the institution's records suggest were never actually generated during the building's first decades of operation. Coney Hatch was the largest asylum in Europe at the time of its construction. Its design capacity was over 1,200 patients. Its engineering capacity, when you examine the underlying infrastructure, implies something larger still. The same observation applies to several American state hospitals constructed in the 1860s and 1870s. Their utility infrastructure, heating plants, water supply, waste management, was built to specifications that exceeded institutional function, in some cases by margins that contemporary engineering records note without fully explaining. Infrastructure built beyond stated need is not inherently anomalous. Engineers plan for contingency. Systems are built with headroom. But headroom of 50% is engineering prudence. Headroom of 200% is something that requires a different kind of explanation. The United Kingdom offers a particular concentration of these cases in the 1860s and 1870s, a period during which the national asylum population was growing rapidly but had not yet reached the levels that the installed infrastructure seemed to anticipate. The broadest version of this observation, the one that crosses most cleanly from institutional analysis into something harder to categorize, involves not just the size of individual facilities, but the network logic implied by their geographic distribution. When you map the locations of major county asylums built in England between 1845 and 1880, a spacing pattern emerges that some researchers have described as functionally consistent. Facilities placed at intervals that suggest not just local catchment logic, but a system designed to cover defined territories with overlapping reach. Individual institutions serving individual counties is the administrative explanation. But the physical spacing, combined with the transport infrastructure that connected many of these sites to railway networks within years of their construction, suggests a system that was designed to be interoperable, not just locally functional. A network implies a logic beyond any single node. And a network of overprepared nodes, distributed with geographical consistency, is a different kind of question than an individual building that was built too large. Some researchers who study this period's institutional geography have begun grouping these observations under a broader interpretive label, one that attempts to account not just for the scale of individual buildings, but for the pattern that emerges when those buildings are considered together. That label, and the arguments surrounding it, is something the historical record makes increasingly difficult to ignore. The word Tartaria appears in European cartographic records as early as the 13th century. On maps produced across several centuries of European geography, it designates a vast and loosely defined territory stretching across Central Asia, parts of Eastern Europe, and, in some editions, considerably further. The label was applied inconsistently. Its borders shifted between mapmakers. Its meaning was never fixed. By the 19th century, the term had largely disappeared from formal geographic usage. The territories it once described had been absorbed into the named empires of Russia, China, and the Ottoman sphere. Tartaria, as a cartographic category, was retired. What the term means today, in the context in which it increasingly circulates, is something different and more contested. In online historical research communities, and in a growing body of self-published and independent scholarship, Tartaria has been reproposed as an interpretive label. It is used not to describe a specific territory or political entity, but to group a set of observations about 19th century architecture, infrastructure, and institutional development that the mainstream historical record, in the view of these researchers, does not fully resolve. The observations grouped under this label include many of the patterns this documentary has examined. Buildings constructed at scales that exceeded immediate population need. Infrastructure engineered to capacities that were not filled for decades. Networks of institutions distributed with a geographic consistency that local administrative logic alone does not cleanly explain. Some researchers using this label go further. They argue that the scale and sophistication of 19th century construction, not just of medical buildings, but of civic, governmental, and industrial infrastructure more broadly, implies the inheritance of an older built environment rather than the construction of an entirely new one. That what the historical record presents as building is, in some cases, more accurately described as reproposing. This is a significant interpretive claim. It is not supported by mainstream architectural history or by the documentary record as currently understood by academic institutions. It is, however, an interpretation that draws on a genuine set of observations, the same observations this documentary has traced across hospital records, asylum construction surveys, and infrastructure specifications. The label does not create the questions. The questions exist independently. The label is one attempt to collect them. The mainstream historical response to these observations takes several forms. The most common is to emphasize the documented growth trajectories of institutionalized populations. Asylums that appeared overbuilt in their first decade were, in many cases, genuinely full within 2 or 3 decades. The Coney Hatch Asylum, built for 1,200, housed over 2,500 patients by the 1890s. The Three Counties Asylum, expanded repeatedly, eventually housed more than 1,600. The scale, in retrospect, was not excessive, it was simply early. This is a reasonable rebuttal. It draws on real numbers. It explains the outcome. What it explains less cleanly is the specificity of initial engineering, the ventilation systems calculated for full occupancy from day one, the water infrastructure sized for populations that took 30 years to materialize, the underground utility corridors built complete and not extended. Outcomes can vindicate scale. They do not automatically vindicate the precision of engineering that anticipated that scale before the population existed to justify it. A second mainstream response attributes the consistency of scale across geographies to professional networks. Medical superintendents corresponded. Journals circulated. International conferences on asylum design were held from the 1850s onward. A shared professional culture, the argument goes, produced shared building standards, which produced the appearance of coordinated scale where none existed. This explanation is well grounded in documented history. It accounts for the similarities in Kirkbride plan hospitals across different American states. It is less convincing when applied across national boundaries, to institutions built under different legislative frameworks, funded by different mechanisms, and administered by populations with limited professional overlap. The Three Counties Asylum and the Government Hospital for the Insane in Washington, D.C. were not the products of a shared professional conversation. Their similarities in proportional logic require a more fundamental explanation than network diffusion provides. A third interpretation, one that sits between the mainstream account and the more expansive claims circulating in independent research communities, focuses on what might be called systemic anticipation. This interpretation does not require hidden actors or erased histories. It proposes, more modestly, that the institutional planning of the mid-19th century was shaped by projections and expectations that were not publicly articulated, that planners, administrators, and legislators in multiple countries were working from population models, epidemiological assumptions, or social forecasts that led them, independently and in parallel, to build at scales that exceeded visible present need. If that is the case, those models and forecasts would constitute a significant piece of the historical record. And their relative absence from the documentation surrounding these construction projects, compared to the detailed engineering records, the architectural drawings, the patient admission logs, is itself a question that the historical record poses without fully answering. You can find the building. You can measure it. You can read its admission records and its engineering specifications. What you find less easily is the document that explains why it was built at the size it was built, before the need for that size had been demonstrated. The Tartaria label, whatever its limitations as a historical framework, has succeeded in drawing renewed attention to a category of observation that conventional institutional history tends to pass over quickly. The scale of 19th-century medical buildings is treated, in most scholarship, as a background fact, something to be noted and moved past in favor of the more legible questions of policy, reform, and treatment philosophy. When the scale becomes the subject of inquiry rather than the background of it, different questions surface. Not questions about who built these structures, or why they built them at all, those answers exist, and they are broadly credible. But questions about the logic of specification that preceded construction. About why the engineering embedded in these buildings assumed a future that, in many cases, arrived slowly and partially. Some researchers interpret that gap, between the scale assumed and the scale that materialized, as evidence of a prior built environment that has been incompletely accounted for. Others interpret it as evidence of ambitious planning cultures operating on forecasts that history has not preserved. Others still treat it as a genuine open question, one that the documentary record raises without resolving. None of these interpretations is without difficulty. None of them is without something to recommend it. What the buildings themselves offer is not an answer. They offer a measurement. A set of dimensions that were chosen by someone, for reasons that the surviving record articulates only partially. The structures still stand. The specifications are still readable. The gap between what was built and what was immediately needed remains, in the physical fabric of these institutions, precisely as large as it was on the day construction was completed. That gap does not close simply because the buildings were eventually filled.